pleased today to introduce our speaker, Chris Knittel, who will be joining us. Chris, just to give you a little bit of a background of what the forum has been pursuing this fall, we began earlier in September, actually, with Eric Johnston from ISO New England, who spoke about the broad agenda of ISO New England. And then we heard from Zainab Magavi from the Home Energy Efficiency Team, HEAT, about geothermal networks. Next week, we're going to hear from Senator Mike Barrett about his interest in the distribution infrastructure, particularly with reference to renewables. And going forward, we'll have conversations on fuels other than fossil fuels as a means of energy sources and other topics of the same kind. So, Chris, we're delighted to have you with us today. Your talk is right in the wheelhouse of what we're trying to get to, and that's the economics of climate change and its impact, the impact of economics on the electric grid, consumer costs, and so on. So, Chris, we're just delighted to have you with us. I'll turn the floor over to you, and if you are ready, we're ready to go.
Great. Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here. I'll note that Mike Barrett lives about 5 houses that way. So he and I talk often. And in fact, he has a bill on the floor right now that if we want to get into it later, I don't have any slides on it, but the goal of that is to revamp how we price electricity, which I happen to write an op-ed that came out in the Boston Globe in May, arguing that we really need to rethink how we price electricity. Our rate structures are based on the electricity grid from 100 years ago, and it's really slowing down electrification. And just to give you a reason why is, if you think about the electricity grid, there are what economists call fixed costs. Those are costs that don't depend on how many electrons are going through the grid. And then there are variable costs that do depend on how much electricity we consume. Basically, to a first order, the energy costs are the variable costs and the wires are the fixed costs. But the way we price electricity is we take those fixed costs and we charge the customer based on how much they use. So we actually convert the fixed costs into a variable cost to the customer. So what that means is that, in fact, the Globe they published my bill, so you could go see what my bill looks like. And over half of the per kilowatt hour charge are fixed costs. So that makes adopting heat pumps more expensive. It makes buying an EV more expensive, an induction stove more expensive. And that's going to really be a really strong headwind to our efforts to electrify. So like I said, I don't have any slides on that, but if it comes out in the discussion, I'm more than happy to talk about those little nuances too. But more generally, so I put together a slide deck that is I'll be talking about the grid, but it's not entirely grid focused. Like you said, Ron, I wanted to start with just a general discussion of the economics behind climate change, but then also the economics behind the policies we adopt to counter climate change, and what those mean, and just how we could do things better, how we could do things worse, and so on. So let me I'll share my slides here. All right, so a little bit, so before I launch into the discussion, just a little bit more background on who I am. So I'm in what's called the Applied Economics group within Sloan. I've been at MIT since 2011. Prior to that, I was at UC Davis and UC Berkeley in the economics departments there, and at a place called the UC Energy Institute, which is where a lot of policy work is done that relates to California policy. I did my PhD in Berkeley. I got out of Berkeley in 1999. So it was the heart of electricity market restructuring. And I did my PhD under Severin Bornstein, who was really at the beginnings of designing new electricity markets where there's actually competition rather than the vertically integrated utility that we were talking about in Maine. There's competition at the generation side, at least. So my PhD work was trying to understand issues around restructuring electricity markets and what that means for investment and what that means for costs and so on. Most of my work now, well, actually, my work is very scattered. In fact, I noticed a number of educators on the call. I'm actually leading an effort to develop a MIT-based high school climate change curriculum. And we're actually piloting it now. We have 14 Massachusetts teachers. We've developed 30 lessons across science, physics, history, math, and English. And it's MIT based in the sense that it draws on the tools that we've developed at MIT around climate change. And it's every lesson plan has a slide deck for the teacher, background reading for the teachers and the students, some lab or assessment, and then also a sheet that shows all the standards that that lecture meets at both federal and Massachusetts. So please, if you know other educators that might find it useful to have these lesson plans, please reach out, and I'm happy to share those with you. But that's not at all my main job. I don't even know why I'm doing that. I'm just doing it because, well, actually, I know why I'm doing it. About 5 years ago, or actually 10 years ago, the Heartland Institute, which is a right-wing leaning think tank, sent out 300,000 climate change curricula to teachers. And my dad, who was a high school math teacher, received one, and it was all climate denialism. So at that point, as I usually do, I woke up at 3 a.m. very upset and emailed my vice president of research, and she was kind enough to give me some money to start developing this high school curriculum. So that's kind of a side job. The other two hats I wear at MIT is I'm the director of the Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research. And that is the way I describe it is it's a hub for social science work around all things energy and the environment. So it started in 1977 in response to the oil shocks, where a group of energy economists at MIT realized that we weren't really doing much on oil markets. We didn't quite understand oil markets because we never had to worry about them because the price of oil just kept declining. And in the early 70s, we started worrying about them. So that center was propped up in 1977. In the 80s, we did a lot of work on local pollution. So NOx, nitrogen oxide emissions, sulfur dioxide emissions, and creating cap and trade markets around those emissions. In the 90s, a lot of the work we did was on electricity restructuring. And then in the 2000s, it's been about climate change. Still doing all those other topics, but just adding to the list of things we do. And then my third job at MIT is I'm the deputy director for policy of the MIT Energy Initiative. And that's the way I describe that as the hub for all things energy at MIT. So that was started by Ernie Moniz before he went to become Secretary of Energy, and is now run by Rob Stoner. And I want to say, Ron, I know we've exchanged a few emails about this, but I teach MBAs for a living. So if I'm not interrupted within 5 minutes of talking, I'm failing. Okay. So I would encourage questions and comments while I'm talking. I'd love for this to be more conversational and less lecture.
Good. Well, we noted, duly noted, Chris.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Because like I said, I'm trying to cover everything, and wherever the discussion goes, I'm happy for it to go in that direction. There'll be topics that I might not have a slide on, but I almost guarantee I have some thoughts on from an economic standpoint, at least. Okay, so that's who I am. And so you kind of know where my biases are coming from. But so let me start with just a general discussion of how economists think of climate change. And then we'll launch into how we think about policies more generally. And then I'll dive into the Inflation Reduction Act, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and the CHIPS Act to think about what the new policies we have around climate change may or may not do to the grid and to our carbon emissions more generally. So I forget who it was, but somebody actually briefly mentioned an op-ed I wrote. I guess it's 4 years. Wow. It was pre-COVID. So who knows how long ago that was. But so it was in the LA Times. And the way I wrote it, the editor at the LA Times didn't quite like it. So she made me rewrite it. But the way I wrote it was, suppose you're an all-powerful, all-knowing, but all-evil being. And you wanted to design an environmental problem that was sure to ruin the world. That would have 5 characteristics. One is, which is partly unique to climate change, is greenhouse gases are what we call a global pollutant. And what that means is that when I release a ton of CO2 into the atmosphere, it doesn't depend on where I release it. It basically does the same exact damage. That's very different than local pollutants. I mentioned nitrogen oxide emissions and sulfur dioxide emissions that we dealt with in the 90s. Those are local pollutants. And what we mean by that is the damages of those emissions stay pretty close to where the pollutant was emitted. So the damages of sulfur dioxide, if you remember acid rain and dying fish in rivers and so on, they stayed by and large within our own borders. And that's important from a policy standpoint because the country who's emitting the pollution has all the right incentive to get rid of it because the damages go to them. So if it's doing $100 worth of damage to the United States is willing to pay $100 to clean up those emissions. Whereas climate change is very different. When you release a ton of CO2 into the atmosphere, the current estimates are that it does about $200 worth of damage to the world. But only about $20 of that is US damage.
If I may,
yeah,
Chris, just one other point which I think is important. The issue is also very localized in time. In other words, it's immediate.
Yep.
So when you say localized, I also think of it in terms of that context.
That's the second point, Eddie. Yeah.
You had an evil
someone speaking, but I can't tell who it is.
I think it's Pete. He muted himself. There you go. So again, that's important because of the global pollutant nature, it creates even more of what economists call a free rider problem, which is that countries want somebody else to cut emissions and not their own emissions.
Yeah.
And that's not true in a local pollutant because the emissions are doing the damage really close to where they are emitted. The second point is Eddie's point, which is much of the damages, although we're seeing damages now, so I don't want to say all, but much of the damages are borne by future generations. That is not true of sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide emissions. And that's important because those future generations aren't at the bargaining table when it comes, they're not voting in the Senate on whether the policy is going to be adopted or not. So that also creates this environment to delay action. The third is that there's no smoking gun. We were able to point to dying fish in rivers as caused by acid rain. We could point to smog as caused by nitrogen oxide emissions or particulate emissions. So those other pollutants have a smoking gun. The fourth and this is brought up a lot as a argument for the US to do nothing, which I would disagree with. But the fourth is that the developing world is more important in some respects in terms of total emissions, at least current total emissions, than the developed world. So that's bad because those developing countries are worried about a lot more things than just climate change. If you're the prime minister of India, climate change, sadly, is probably third or fourth on your list of things to fix while you're prime minister. So that too creates a environment for inaction. And then the last is, and this is, in fact, one of my former students teaches civil engineering at University of Washington, and he and I just discovered we start with this anecdote, but if you were to design the perfect energy medium, it would be a gallon of gasoline without CO2 emissions or local pollutant emissions. That the liquid fuels are just beautiful in so many respects. And I know you have a talk by Ahmed coming up, so I'll leave it to him to fill you in on all those details. But it's a liquid. We can pipe it. It's very energy dense. There's just so many nice things about fossil-based fuels. So it's going to be hard to transition. It's not going to be as seamless as some people want us to believe. So all five of those things really create an environment to do very little around climate change. And it's, in my view, that makes leadership from the developed world even more important. And we have a what's called the COP coming up in Dubai, where the leaders of the world come together and try to fix climate change. And unfortunately, we just haven't been doing enough on that front.
Chris, I have a question about climate change. This is Walter. What effects do wildfires and wars and pipeline explosions, like in the North Sea, have on climate change? Is that a big effect or no effect or not counted? How does that work?
So certainly the CO2 emissions that are emitted from a wildfire get counted as more of a pulse in CO2 emissions. But I think, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, that if you just add up global pollution, CO2 pollution, I think the Maui wildfire, I don't even know if you would see it in there, right? You might see a little bit of a blip there. There was a nice paper a few years ago, I've been meaning to track this down, that looked at these so-called nonlinearities or catastrophic events like the melting of the solar ice or the permafrost that would emit a bunch of methane emissions. And they actually concluded those are important, but not really as important as we often think of them as. Yeah. Okay, so even though there's some unique aspects about climate change, at least from an economist perspective, it's a classic example of what we call a negative externality, which is an externality is a cost borne by somebody who's not making the production or the buying decision of the good. So we have negative externalities all over the place, right? So secondhand smoke is a negative externality, right? The person doing the smoking is not incurring that secondhand smoke. So that's an externality or an external cost to somebody else. Pollution is an externality. Traffic is an externality. There are also positive externalities. Things like if I do research and development, some of that research and development gets spilled over to other people and so on. So we economists have been dealing with externalities for a long time. We know how to deal with them from a policy standpoint. So there's nothing new on that front. So the basic economics are not that different. Part of it gets to what we kind of talked about at the introduction stage, is convincing policymakers and the public that this is something we need to deal with. And I'll have some thoughts on that as well. But the basic economics of a negative externality is that you overconsume that product. So whether it's gasoline that leads to 20 pounds of CO2 emitted when you burn a gallon of gasoline, or burning coal to generate electricity, you'll do too much of that because the firms and the consumers aren't internalizing those extra costs to everybody. So that opens a door for policy to fix things. So I'm an economist. By law, I have to show you a supply demand graph. So here's the supply and demand graph. So since you're not all economists, I'll describe what this is. So imagine the market for gasoline. So we talk about a demand curve for gasoline. That's downward sloping. So that's the downward sloping curve there. Why is it downward sloping? Well, every additional gallon of gasoline that we consume brings society less and less happiness, or less and less welfare. So the willingness to pay for gasoline is falling as you consume more gasoline. That's why we always draw demand curves downward sloping. The supply curve is upward sloping because as you make more and more gasoline, you have to use less efficient refiners, you have to use heavier oil, so that requires more energy to refine it, and so on. So the supply curve represents what we call the marginal cost. So the cost of producing that last gallon of gasoline, and that's upward sloping because as we produce more gasoline, it gets more and more expensive to produce that last gallon of gasoline. So when we have an externality, what we have is a situation where we have a private marginal cost. So that's the cost of the refiners, the oil drillers, all the vertical chain of things that are required to get that gallon of gasoline produced. We have their private costs, but an externality means we also have a second curve, an upward sloping curve, which is the social marginal cost. And the social marginal cost includes all those private marginal costs plus the externality, plus the cost to society not borne by those firms. So the way I've drawn it here is to make the assumption, which is not a terrible assumption, it turns out, that every gallon of gasoline that we burn generates $2 extra of damage to the world. So the external cost is $2 per gallon of gasoline. So if you left the market alone, then you would get to the intersection of the private marginal cost and the demand for gasoline, and that would intersect at a price of P sub 0 and Q sub 0. Where society wants to be, however, is at Q star, because that's the point where the willingness to pay for gasoline, the demand curve, intersects the marginal social cost of making that gasoline, the social marginal cost curve. So that's the point that with the negative externality, you overproduce, you overconsume. And that's what we're doing with climate change. It's now, in most of the US at least, free to emit a ton of CO2 into the atmosphere. So I'm not gonna incorporate that into my decision making. So I'm gonna consume too much carbon dioxide, or more accurately, I'm gonna consume too much of products that contain carbon dioxide, because it's not the CO2 itself that gives me happiness. It's the CO2, it's the product that has CO2 embedded in it. So the economists take these curves and then we measure inefficiency. And the inefficiency is that triangle there. I won't go through, I just taught the MBAs this, so I'll resist going through in detail what that is, but that's the inefficiency if you leave the market alone. That's the social surplus that gets destroyed by not intervening into this market. So it is a triangle, at least the way I've drawn it. And, you know, I've got some back of the envelope calculations here that in the US, we consume about 140 billion gallons of gasoline each year. I've done some work where If you added $2 to the cost of gasoline, you would get to about 125 billion gallons of gasoline. So the width of that triangle is 15 billion gallons. The height of that triangle is $2. So the area of that triangle is about $15 billion of waste every year by not intervening into the market. So I'll talk about how should we intervene into the market. I'll talk about that in a second. But there's a joke I was once told by a Senate staffer, and he said that economists worry about triangles and policymakers worry about rectangles. So if we look at this graph, we economists worry about this deadweight loss triangle. But the other interesting area in this graph is that trapezoid there, which is the gap between the private marginal costs and social marginal costs. That's the height of the trapezoid, and the width is how many gallons of gasoline we consume. That's the external cost. That's the damage that drivers and refineries are doing to other people. So some of that is not waste to the economists. Some of that is just a transfer from those other people to drivers. So we don't count that as waste because it's surplus that's going to somebody at least. The triangle is the only quote unquote waste, but a policymaker worries about that trapezoid because think about future generations. If all the damage of climate change was future generations, the future generations would bear that trapezoid. And that's a much bigger area than that triangle, right? I talked about CO2 being a global pollutant where one estimate is every ton of CO2 does $20 or $200 worth of damage. 20 of that is in the US. Well, that means $180 of that damage is going to other countries. That's a big trapezoid, right? So we need to, from a policy standpoint and an ethical standpoint, worry about not just the triangle, but the full external costs of our decision making. And you're seeing that's the best argument from the developed world for, from the developing world. The developing world has a legitimate argument to go to the developed world and say, hey, you owe us money, right? The United States, since the Industrial Revolution, you've put in all these tons of CO2 into the atmosphere. That's doing damage to us. There's certainly an ethical argument. It's not an economics argument, so I'm not going to say I'm the expert on this, but there's certainly an ethical argument for the developed world paying for those past CO2 emissions as well as the current CO2 emissions. So how do you fix the market? Well, we turn to this French economist named Arthur Pigou, who wrote a paper in 1920 on this very topic. And he wrote that the way to fix the market is to undo the fact that when a refinery sells a gallon of gasoline, they don't pay that $2. How do we make them pay that $2? We adopt a $2 gasoline tax, and then they would now internalize that $2. So what Pigou wrote is that we should tax any product that has an externality by the amount of the externality. And so now that $2 is actually internalized by the firm and the consumers playing in these markets, and they're going to end up being at Q star. So it's a pretty easy fix. Easy in quotes, because you have to measure that vertical distance. You have to know what damage every gallon of gasoline does. And I'll talk about how we go about doing that. That's not trivial, but we certainly have some estimates. Another way to do it, but instead of just a tax, is to do what's called cap.
I'll be down in a minute.
Cap and trade was actually first developed in the 1980s in the United States by the Bush Senior administration under the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. And actually, the economists who pioneered President Bush to adopt those is Richard Smallensee, or Dick Smallensee, who's the former dean of Sloan. He was on the Council of Economic Advisors for Bush during that time. And he's too humble to say it, but he basically convinced President Bush to adopt cap and trade as a way to limit nitrogen oxide and sulfur dioxide emissions, as opposed to just regulation. So the alternative was going to be in the 80s to require all coal plants to install scrubbers. And what Smallensee convinced the Bush administration of doing was to create a cap on nitrogen oxide and sulfur dioxide emissions. So a maximum amount that the country can emit, and then divide that cap into what are called allowances. So a permit to emit a ton of sulfur dioxide, and either auction off those permits or give them to the power plants so that they can trade those permits, and then those permits generate value, and that actually becomes equivalent to the tax on sulfur dioxide emissions. And there's been a fair bit of work in the economics literature that has shown that doing that instead of the alternative, which was just to require all coal plants to put in scrubbers and SCRs, saved about, I think the estimates are like 50%. So it was much more efficient way to limit those pollutants than regulation. That was in the 80s. And Smallensee is actually my predecessor at CEPR, the center I run. I took over for Dick Smallensee at CEPR. So from the 1980s to the year 2008, cap and trade was the way the Republicans always argued we should deal with environmental issues, because it was this great success that they came up with. In the 90s, or actually in the early 2000s, Europe adopted cap and trade for carbon dioxide emissions. And that's the graph I'm showing you here, where they have a total limit on CO2 emissions within Europe. Each country then gets allotted a certain amount of emissions, and then each country gives out those permits to CO2 emitting entities, whether it's power plants or manufacturing facilities and so on. And because the cap is below what the economy would want to do otherwise, those permits have value, and those permits become a tax on emitting a ton of CO2 into the atmosphere. The current prices for those are about $90 a ton. So every ton of CO2 emissions a European company puts into the atmosphere, they pay $90 to do that, for the right to do that. So that's why it's equivalent to that Pigouvian tax that I mentioned before. Not to get into too much US policy history, but in 2008, the Obama administration had a bill called Waxman-Markey, which would have done the same thing within the US. It would have created a cap and trade policy within the US. That got through the House, but never came up to vote in the Senate. I had friends in the Obama administration at the time who said that basically President Obama felt that he could get either healthcare or cap and trade through the Senate, and he had to choose which one he could do. He had a certain amount of political capital, and he could only get one through the Senate, and he chose healthcare. I can't argue that was a bad decision. As a climate researcher, I probably prefer cap and trade, but at the same time, Obamacare has also done a lot of good as well. So we were on the cusp of having something similar to the European system in 2008. California has a cap and trade program. So they have something that looks like this. Their permit prices are not as high, so it's not as stringent as the European system. We in New England also have a cap and trade program called RGGI, but those permit prices are even lower. So it exists. It's only for the electricity markets, but it's not doing nearly, quote unquote, enough from a from a climate change perspective, but it's nice. It's certainly a nice to have. Okay. Other places around the world have prices on carbon. So I'm often when I recommend carbon pricing to people, I'm often their reaction is often that it's politically infeasible. It's not politically infeasible. All of Canada, every province of in Canada has to have a price on carbon by federal law. They could either do it through cap and trade or a carbon price, but they have to have one. China is actually just adopted cap and trade. Europe has the cap and trade system, and individual countries also have their own carbon tax adder to the cap and trade system. Bill?
Chris, I wonder if you could speak briefly on carbon dividend and fee proposal, which has been around for a very long time, going back to George Shultz.
Yep.
And I think we almost had it with the Build Back Better. But what are your thoughts on that? And maybe you could explain it a little bit.
Yeah, Bill, I promise to come back to that. And if I don't, remind me, but I'm going to show you a map of what household carbon footprints look like around the US. And that's where I'll bring in that proposal.
Thank you.
Yeah, I should have mentioned I'm the George P. Shultz professor of applied economics. When I was growing up, shows you kind of the nerd that I am. George was a hero of mine. He passed away recently, which is a shame. I used to have dinner with him once or twice a year. George is the one of only 2 Americans to hold 4 cabinet level positions. And the other one was from the 1700s. I forget the name of it, but he was Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of Labor, and head of O&B. He's just a titan in the economics profession. So I'm quite honored to hold that professorship. Okay, but back to climate change here. So an interesting development. Again, this is kind of a hodgepodge of all the policy issues that are floating around now. So Europe has this cap and trade system. And if you think about what that means is suppose I produce a ton of steel in Europe. Well, that ton of steel costs about $800 to produce. And European steel makers, through the process of making that steel, emit about a little bit over a ton of CO2 per ton of steel. So European steel makers have to pay about $100 of cap and trade costs for every ton of CO2 they emit. But if China makes a ton of steel and exports it into Europe, they're not paying those cap and trade for those cap and trade permits. And in addition, Chinese steel emits about a little bit over 2 tons of CO2 per ton of steel. So the Chinese steel is both dirtier and cheaper because they don't have to pay for these permits. So Europe just last month adopted what's called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, the CBAM. And what the CBAM does is anything imported into Europe, now it's mostly metals, but it's going to become mostly every product. But right now, when you export a ton of steel from China to Europe, the European government is going to have some calculation of the CO2 embedded in that ton of steel and then charge the Chinese steel manufacturer for that price. That's the CBAM, the border adjustment. So that creates a ton of interesting geopolitics, because who gets to keep that money? Well, Europe does, because Europe is the one charging the Chinese company. But if China adopts a carbon tax, say they also adopt a $900 carbon fee, then they don't have to pay the border adjustment. So the border adjustment is based on the difference between the European carbon price and your domestic carbon price. So that has lots and lots of exporting countries scrambling to adopt their own carbon price so that at least they get to keep the money, right? So there's this interesting incentive now for China, India, lots of Latin American countries, even some African countries that are big exporters into Europe to adopt their own carbon price so that at least they can keep the money instead of Europe charging them at the border. So
Chris, with the money that is the revenue that is generated, what is the goal? Well, I mean, what is it used for, and how is it administered?
Yeah, so I haven't read a ton on what Europe plans to do with the money. My guess is they'll probably fund green investments. They won't do what we talked about briefly that I'm going to get back to, which is a dividend plan. But my hunch is they're gonna fund green investments. And the basic justification for it is to put European steel and Chinese steel on a level playing field.
Yeah.
Because now the Europeans have to pay these fees, and any importer into Europe does not have to pay the fees. So that's the main motivation, as well as the fact that you're going to tax the Chinese steel even more because it's dirtier. So we need to get those prices right so that we have an incentive to make
it would just be reassuring from a personal perspective if they were to take the revenue and do something really constructive with it.
Yeah. What to do with the revenue is like I said, I'm going to talk about it. I'll talk about some trade-offs there.
Thank you.
So here's just some headlines. I was on a panel with somebody from Tata Power a couple weeks ago, where India is now thinking about their own carbon tax in direct response to this CBAM. Which is fascinating because it might push the world to do more carbon pricing, which is what we economists have been screaming from the top of our lungs for decades now. All right, so some issues about this, and these issues exist even if we're not doing a carbon tax or a cap and trade system. But we need an estimate of the damage of a ton of CO2. And that's not a trivial thing to do. I could give in fact, I give an 1.5-hour lecture to my class on just this one topic alone. It's hard, right? So you emit a ton of CO2 into the atmosphere. What happens? Well, the atmospheric scientists need to tell us what it's going to do to weather patterns, not the climate, not just temperature, but things like wildfire risk and flood risk and so on. So that's a very complex system. That then the changes in climate patterns then feeds into the macroeconomy. So the macroeconomists have to tell us how will that change in weather patterns, the climate, impact the macroeconomy. Then the economists have to tell us how that will change CO2 emissions. Then, because these damages from climate change are happening, that ton of CO2 lasts about 300 years in the atmosphere. So you have to estimate those damages over a 300-year period. So then somebody has to tell us, how do you trade off damages 100 years from now with damages today? Because if you think about the political decision is to incur a cost today to not emit that ton of CO2 so that we're helping people for 300 years. So you can't estimate the damage of CO2 without taking a stand, an ethical stand, on how do you value future generations. No discipline that I know of, academic discipline that I know of, is a subject matter expert on how you value future generations. None of us are, right? But we have to do it in order to make this calculation. So interestingly enough, the federal government just came out with new guidance as to how you're going to do that. It's called the Circular A4, one of the most boring documents, yet one of the most important documents. In terms of the ratio of importance to interest, it's probably the highest out there. So they took a stand where the discount rate should be about 2%. So we actually have a number now on how we value future generations. Eddie.
Yes, I think it's strange having converted a little bit to being a science fiction or speculative fiction writer from my physics background. By the way, I should have mentioned that I've also been extremely interested in climate change and done a great deal of a number of talks actually in the area. But one of the things that pops into my mind is related to what I call opportunity costs. The opportunity if we had done something perfectly right. The story of where could we be if we actually did things right is always seems to be lost in the full picture of discussing issues such as climate change. By that I mean, let us suppose that we actually did everything just right. What opportunities would be there for the future generations? The additions to research, the additions to social conditions, the additions to effective transportation, that kind of stuff always seems to be missing. I just wondered if
so certainly
touching on it, but not quite. I think as far as I'd like to have that picture.
So the sooner we respond to climate change, the cheaper it'll be to respond. And that's true in the past too. So if we had started doing this in the 80s or maybe even the 70s, when it started to become pretty apparent. The basic research around climate change was done in the 1880s. I forget Fournier, I think, is a French economist, a male that always gets the credit. But the first paper published on the topic was published by a woman named Eunice Foote in, I think, 1884. The first lab experiments on the greenhouse gas effect, where she put different mixtures of air into tubes and shined a light on them and measured the impact on temperature. So we've known about this for quite some time. The male economists also a couple years later did some back of the envelope calculations based just on chemistry, and got it pretty close, just based on chemical reactions. So yeah, we've known about this for quite some time. In the 80s, there's a great documentary. I'm going to blank on who the producer was, but it went through in the 1980s when the Clinton administration almost passed the BTU tax, and that would have had transformative effects on our economy. I would argue, in terms of, like you said, Eddie, the transportation system, land use patterns, incentives to invest in energy efficiency, and so on. So yeah, the earlier we start, the cheaper it's going to be. There's another concept in economics called a sunk cost, which is, we should have done this in the 80s, but we're in 2023 now, so how much should we dwell on the past? Let's, going forward, what should we do? Right. And that's what my research tends to focus on. But I totally agree that we should have been doing this yesterday, and yesterday's in quotes, to represent the past.
I think just one other little point of where I'm trying to go with this. It's the vision of where we want to be.
Yep.
And I think most people have a very bland idea of, it all sounds negative to someone in the public when you're talking about carbon taxes and this kind of stuff. That sounds like something coming out of my pocket. But if I had some, like Star Trek in a way was a tremendous vision of the future. We don't have that as an accompaniment with, say, climate change. It's always dealing with the negative. Can we have a vision that is so positive it drives us to do things for that future? And I think that's where the social discussion seems to foul.
I think I agree with you. That's probably not the economist's job, but we do have technologists and we do have sociologists that I think could be more active in that arena. We economists kind of view our job as educating policymakers on the costs and benefits of doing things. It's not we're not the experts on kind of coming up with that vision. We do make predictions, which are almost always wrong. On average, they're right, but always wrong. But yeah, I take your point for sure. Gary?
Yeah, hi. Thanks. This is really interesting. Sometimes I see these PowerPoint charts with numbers like $50 and $190 and the social cost of carbon and so on. And then I wonder, are those things really meaningful in the context where we're dealing with an existential crisis? And whether it wouldn't be more practical to just look at the fact that, obviously the CO2 concentration is way too high. We're already seeing that in 2022 and now this year. And shouldn't we just be gradually increasing the social cost of carbon and adding that to all forms of carbon on an incremental basis until we stop increasing the atmospheric concentration? Wouldn't that be a better test than whether we're where we are relative to some sort of idealized calculation of the social cost?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that, but in particular because you said start somewhere and gradually increase. I noticed, for example, Drew said in the chat said that we need $100 or $1,000 a ton, which would be a $10 gasoline tax. I guarantee you, if you put that bill forth in Congress, it would go nowhere, right? We need to, and this is more opinion than economics because it's about policymaking, the sausage that's being made. We need to be realistic as to what can get through Congress. And if we start with a $10 gas tax, it's going nowhere, right? If we start with $200, a $2 gas tax, it's going nowhere. But if we start with $50 a ton cost of CO2 and do what you said, Gary, which is increase it by $10 every year forever, then maybe we have a shot. And when British Columbia, one of the first early adopters of a carbon tax, adopted it, there were a few ways that they designed it to get buy-in. One is they start at $20 and they raised it $5 a year. So they started with the equivalent of a 20-cent gas tax. And then they did what I forget who mentioned it earlier. They guaranteed that basically all the money would go back to people. So the British Columbia carbon tax gets a pot of money. They divide that pot of money by the number of households in British Columbia, and each year they send out a dividend check equal to that number. And that got buy-in because some people at least inherently don't trust the government to spend money. So then at least you're guaranteeing that they're not spending those revenues or quote unquote wasting those revenues. So I think there is a way to design a carbon tax that gets really high at some point, that gets political buy-in. And I keep promising you this map that I think is coming up soon. Okay, so federal government, the US federal government has a $50, the Biden administration has a $50 tax now, or social cost of carbon. This started under Obama, started at about $35 under Obama. Sadly, the Trump administration, when they came into office, just changed the discount rate that's used to calculate it. And they also just measured the damage to the US, and that got it down to $7. So this isn't, potentially this is not a very politically durable way to do things, sadly enough. We can't necessarily, it's hard to think of ways to tie the hands of future administrations that don't believe in climate change, which is very frustrating. So here's some maps that I wanted to show you. So one is, these are not my own estimates. This comes from a group mostly out of Berkeley. These are the estimates of the economic damage by county in the US. Ironically enough, a lot of the damages are in the South, which happens to also be more likely to be climate deniers in the South. So they're kind of shooting themselves in the foot in many ways. Although I will say that if you want to find a Republican that believes in doing something about climate change, on average, they're going to be from Florida, because Florida sees the damage that's happening to climate change now. So sadly, to get back to the earlier discussion about we should have started doing things in the 80s, sadly, some states aren't going to want to do anything until they see the direct damage that climate change is having, and that is going to make it way more expensive and also hard to undo some of those damages. My own work has asked a slightly different question, which is, what is the average carbon footprint of households? And this I do at what's called a census tract level. So there's 75,000 census tracts in the US. And this is what that map looks like. So you can see two stylized facts in this map. One is carbon footprints are higher in middle America. And if you squint, you'll also see that they're higher in suburbia and rural America relative to cities. So you could kind of see where the cities are in this map because they're green. Now, politically, what does that mean? Well, that means that unless we design policies in a smart way, the middle America is going to incur the bulk of those costs. Now, you might argue, so what? Screw them. They should incur the costs. Their carbon footprints are high. I'm sympathetic to that, but at the same time, I realize that if that's the argument, you'll never get anything passed, right? So we need to accept the empirical realities of the situation and design policies in a smart way. So the way we talk about doing or a carbon tax in the paper there is that you don't have to so we do a tax and dividend plan where you send checks out to households, but you could send different size checks to different regions of the country to get political buy-in. So send bigger checks to middle America. There's a good argument for doing that because they're generating more of the tax revenue anyways. So you can design policies in a way that does not lead to lots of money flowing from middle America to the coasts, which is just a recipe for political disaster, if you ask me. Bill.
Yeah, just looking at that map, I would say that a lot of that is related to the fuel used to generate electricity.
It is, yeah. So in the paper, we break it up by electricity, by natural gas use, by gasoline, by all of the major components of a carbon footprint.
Yeah, a good resource that I use is the eGrid EPA that collects it by at least by state.
That's what we're using to calculate the embedded carbon in electricity. Yeah. Eddie, and then Ron, I thought.
Yes, is the map somewhat misleading in some senses?
Because of where people live?
It's where people live,
Yeah.
that's true. But in some respects, is there kind of a leakage of benefits as a consequence of producing that CO2 that goes out to wider areas than the one we've actually just...
Yeah, so you could certainly...
So you can make an argument that basically everybody should be pitching in rather than just the Midwest.
That's right. So you could measure, if you wanted to, the difference between what they're paying and the benefit that they're getting. So that would combine this map with this map, right? But most of those benefits, 2 points though, most of those benefits would be in the South. So we would be changing the color in the South and not the North, northern Midwest. The other is, remember, about 10% of that CO2, that whatever social cost of carbon, is only going to the US. So really the full map is you're asking these people in middle America to incur some costs, and $180 of that benefit, or a big chunk of that benefit, is going to other people. Again, I want us to do that. But we have to realize that that's what we're asking those households to do, right? Ron?
Yeah, my comment is not so much a question as a comment. We're dangerously close to 12 noon.
Oh, okay. I will speed up and maybe.
Yeah, no, I don't want.
Yeah.
I had another thought, Chris, and
Yeah.
that would be that maybe we need to have you come back if you're willing.
I'm
But
happy to come back.
Yeah, good. Let's go forward though.
Yeah, all right. All right. So that's households. We did something similar for jobs recently, and that's it's in the middle of the publication process now, where we basically took the average carbon content of jobs in a county, and it has a similar kind of political reality, which is, the middle America's carbon content of jobs is higher. So again, there's no value judgment. I view my job as giving policymakers data, but these are the data realities of dealing with climate change that we have to confront in thinking about policies. You could say, look, who cares about that oil job? They're doing damage to the world and they should lose their job. There's an argument for that. But there's also an argument for saying, we need to design a policy so that we get them another job somewhere, right? So whatever the climate policy has to deal with these data realities. Thankfully, I'm going to get to the Biden policies in a second. The Biden policies do have some flavors of that, which are pretty exciting. So even without the data, the policymakers know this. But I will mention that in December of last year, from what I heard from DC, a carbon tax was very much on the table all the way to the end until they came out with the Inflation Reduction Act. And I kind of had some idea that was the case, because just about every night I would get an email from a staffer saying, hey, can you show me the map for my district? So they were asking, trying to understand how a carbon tax would impact the households in their district. Then I would get an email saying, can you take out carbon from gasoline? And then the next day in the news, I would hear they're considering a carbon tax without gasoline. So I was kind of getting this information a few hours ahead of time in terms of what was going on in the negotiations. So we don't, like I said, California has a cap and trade system. Reggie kind of has one, or the Northeast kind of has one. But what we've been doing instead, and certainly what the Biden administration is focused on, is subsidies. So instead of taxing the bad thing, we're going to subsidize the good thing. This is more expensive, almost by definition, because what it means is that you're going to do too much of the thing, right? So if you think about subsidizing electric vehicles as opposed to taxing gasoline, you're going to get more vehicles than you otherwise would. So we're going to need to do even more to decarbonize the grid, because in the carbon tax world, we would have fewer electrons going into EVs because there would be fewer cars. But if you subsidize cars, you're going to get more cars. So that means more electricity. So that means you have to move up the cost curve, so to speak, to decarbonize. So that's the key inefficiency from subsidies. I'm glad they're doing it. It's better than nothing. But we could very much increase the efficiency of what we're doing. And now let me start with some good news. I am shocked the Biden administration has done what they have done. If you had told me in January of 2021 that the Biden administration would pass 3 bills where one was entirely focused on climate change and 2 had a big climate change component, I would have laughed at you. But that's what they did. So the Inflation Reduction Act is basically funneling about $400 billion into green subsidies. The CHIPS Act has about $7 billion for zero carbon research and development. The I still call it the bipartisan infrastructure bill, but the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act has about $5 to $10 billion of subsidies for electric charging stations and electric buses. So this is a big deal, and quite shocking that they were able to get it through. So big compliment to the Biden administration on that front. Like I said, it's a ton of subsidies, subsidizing everything that reduces carbon, all the way from solar panels to wind farms to critical minerals, to electric vehicles, to hydrogen, to carbon capture and sequestration. So there's just lots of, which are equivalent to subsidies. They're more accurately referred to as tax credits, but they're basically subsidies for clean tech. And there's lots and lots of estimates out there as to what it's doing or going to do. I'll highlight a new development in my center, which is joint with the Rhodium Group and spearheaded by a gentleman called Brian Deese. Brian Deese was the head of the National Economic Council under Biden. He just left the Biden administration. So he joined my center this past summer. And Brian was the brainchild behind the Inflation Reduction Act. And what we've started within the center is really just a measurement project where every quarter we're going to measure clean tech investment. Not how much, we're not going to make claims as to how much of that is coming from the Inflation Reduction Act. It's just purely providing data to you and I, and data to academics so that they might do some interesting academic papers with it, but just so that we can understand, have some idea of what investment is doing within clean tech in the US. Because the data from the tax credits aren't going to come except for a year-long lag, right? So we want more real-time data so we could understand what investment is doing. So here are two estimates of what the Inflation Reduction Act will do to US CO2 emissions. I've called the left one realistic and the right one optimistic. The left one is written by one of my colleagues, so I have to kind of give it its stamp of approval, by Catherine Wolfram, who just joined my group within Sloan this year. So you can see the top solid black line is what CO2 emissions have been doing. And then what they have is the gray line, which is what they would have done without the Inflation Reduction Act. And then the blue line is what their prediction of what they will do with the Inflation Reduction Act economy-wide. And then the dotted line is just the power sector. So if we focus on the solid lines, their prediction is the Inflation Reduction Act will add about 8 percentage points to the reduction in CO2 emissions from the US. By 2035, a more optimistic estimate is out of Princeton, what's called the Repeat Project, where they find that the Inflation Reduction Act will reduce emissions by about 12 percentage points relative to what would have happened. Neither of these, or actually the Princeton estimate gets us to our 2030 goal, or close to it, at least closer to it, of a 50% reduction relative to 2005 levels by 2030. Neither of these get us to net zero by 2050, which is an often cited goal. But you can see that, again, these are moving us in the right direction. Again, better than nothing, not enough, but more than I would have predicted in January 2021, for sure. Walter.
Yeah, Chris, can the government, in particular Congress, repeal the IRA and then have a devastating effect?
Yep.
So let's say Republicans take over the Senate and in Congress and the presidency. What happens to the IRA?
Yeah. So the IRA was passed using a trick. I don't know if that's me or
Yeah, no, it's one of the participants.
I think Wayne is
Wayne,
that.
can you turn off your microphone, please?
I wanted to ask a question.
Okay, I'll answer Walter's question and then get to yours. So the Inflation Reduction Act was passed via this shoot, I'm blanking on the name now. Oh, reconciliation trick. Under reconciliation, you only need 50 senators to pass a purely set of budget rules. So you can't pass regulations under the Inflation Reduction Act. You could not pass a new law like a carbon tax, or you might be able to get, you couldn't do cap and trade under reconciliation for sure. So that means you only need 50 plus a tiebreaker or 51 senators to pass it. I believe it can be undone in the same way. So you would need, so if the Republicans took over the Senate and the presidency, the Inflation Reduction Act, I believe, I'm not a constitutional scholar, but I believe they could get rid of it just as quickly as they passed it, which is again my point about getting buy-in. I truly believe, again, this isn't an economic statement, so take it with a grain of salt. I truly believe that we will not have durable climate policy until we get Republicans on board, because we're just going to be dealing with this constant cycle of Democrats push it through, Republicans repeal it. Democrats push it through, Republicans deal it. So until we get buy-in from Republicans, I just worry that we're just going to be doing starts and stops. Now, I don't know how to get the buy-in from them, but I know how not to get the buy-in, right? So we need political science scholars to help us out on that front. Wayne, could I go to Wayne and then?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I have a question. What fraction of the carbon emission is caused by automobiles in the United States?
I believe it's about a third, and it's growing. It's a growing third because our electricity grid is decarbonizing faster than industry and transportation. So
the reason I see that is because I don't know if it showed up so far, but there's a cultural attachment within the U.S. to cars with internal combustion engines. Yep. You see NASCAR and F1 and car shows all over the drag racing. Just like we've never been able to pass gun control legislation, because if you watch television in the United States, every other TV show has people running around shooting at each other with guns. And you don't really get a feel for how dangerous they actually are. And so I was wondering, if it's a small percentage, maybe we ought to focus on the other contributors first and less on that, except for maybe public transportation.
Right.
I don't think most people in the city would object to public transportation as long as they could still have their car for joyriding.
Yeah, it's not a small percentage, and also it's probably one of the cheaper ways to decarbonize. Moving us from ICE vehicles to EVs is much easier than decarbonizing steel production or much of manufacturing.
Concrete.
And I hear you. So I grew up in the Central Valley of California. In high school, I bought a 68 Mustang Fastback and completely took the engine apart and made it into a race car. And that's what I drove around in high school. So I am part of that car culture. But the nice thing about EVs is they're faster than internal combustion engine vehicles. So if we could just get people in them and a robust charging network, because my own work, which I'm going to have to come back, Ron, I guess, and present, my own work has shown that the hurdle now is not the price of the EV, it's the fact that we don't have enough charging stations.
Yes, there needs to be a lot of infrastructure investment.
Exactly.
Chris, I promised you that we would finish by noon, and I know you have a busy schedule, and we're at noon. I think I would really, I know this has been a real tour de force. And seriously, I hope you will come back because I know there are questions. I have a number of questions. I know there are others in our crew who have questions and conversation that we would really like to have with you. But this has been incredibly informative. And I really want to thank you for that. I will go to Eddie for the last word today. But I just want to say this has been just a wonderful presentation and a very thoughtful, thought-provoking conversation for all of us. So I thank you very much for that. Eddie, go ahead.
Yes,
And before Eddie starts talking, I'm just going to end. I want to show you one more slide, which is my license plate. And just so you know that I live and breathe this stuff, my license plate is tax CO2.
I've seen that.
Now, oh, look, there's another one, Pennsylvania. That's awesome. That's amazing. Now, the irony is that it's on an internal combustion based vehicle because the vehicle that I want, they haven't or the vehicle I have, they haven't electrified yet. And I am sure that if we had a carbon tax, there would be an electric version of that.
We get a Mustang EV.
Yeah. So we have we have a place in New Hampshire. I do a lot of kind of off-roading and things like that. So it would have to be a Lightning, an F-150 Lightning. Yeah. Eddie, you could have the final word.
very good. I just wanted to, in terms of legislation and policy, if you're going to try and get the Republicans on side, one of the hardest businesses is trying to see what vision you can provide them that would make them feel like they're going to get votes.
Yeah.
And I think your task really is to somehow provide that kind of regulatory vision that would enable them to come on side.
Yes.
That's what I was trying to get at before, that you have to have that, you have to have something there that will grab the populace, that will push the Republicans to actually do something. I don't know what that is. It's
incentives. Isn't it incentives? There have to be incentives.
So maybe if I come back, I'll expand.
That will give them a sense that they can really expand the economy and make themselves look good.
So if I come back, and I'm happy to come back, like I said, I'll talk about this, what's called the Roosevelt Project, which Ernie Moniz, when he came back to MIT, started within my center. And so what we do in that is we actually develop plans for 4 regions of the US to decarbonize in a way that does not leave behind the most vulnerable groups. So we, and it's available on CEPR's website, but we do a deep dive into the Gulf Coast, Appalachia, the industrial Midwest, and this might be surprising, but New Mexico. And each of those 4 regions have very different hurdles to hurdle for decarbonizing. And each of those deep dives are 200 pages of policy prescriptions, economic modeling, focus groups, discussions with local stakeholders to basically give them a recipe to decarbonize without leaving behind, whether it's in some areas, it's Native Americans, in other areas, it's low-income coal workers. So you talk to a coal miner, and the first thing they say is, my grandfather was a coal miner, my dad was a coal miner, I'm a coal miner. So that's a hurdle you have to get rid of. So we talk with focus groups to say, well, how can we switch your mentality there? But the economic challenge is if you're in Appalachia and you don't have a college degree, the only way you could ever earn over $60,000 is being a coal miner. That's overstating things, but it's almost the truth. So that's a huge hurdle. So to Eddie, to your point, like, what is that vision? You need to convince them there's something else out there that can pay them a middle-class salary that doesn't require a high school curriculum. One of the success stories
manufacturing.
In terms of transitions in the US is the Pittsburgh area. So if you think about Pittsburgh, they've reinvented themselves 3 times, right? So they started as a coal mining place, then they switched to steel when the coal industry kind of collapsed. The 2 bad transitions, but now they're a healthcare area, right? So they've done it right. So that's the type of vision that we're trying to not sell, again, to provide data for policymakers. But you have to think about doing that in the Gulf Coast, right? How do you replace those refining jobs and those oil drilling jobs? In New Mexico, the challenge is I think 80% of New Mexico revenue comes from coal. How do you replace those state revenues, right? How do you decarbonize, or how do you build EVs? And we just saw this happen now. How do you transition to EVs, which require less labor without screwing the auto workers, right? So these are all challenges that are real. And it's easy for me, the academic, to say, just price carbon and move on. But if I say that, nothing will ever happen, right? So I really view my job as to actually provide data to policymakers that lead to outcomes, not just academic work, right?
Well, that's my challenge to you.
Yes, I'm trying.
Kind of economics that actually says, well, this is what you could do, and this is the opportunity that you have.
Yeah. Wayne is from the future talking to us. Wayne, do you want to?
No, I was just saying it'll have to be manufacturing jobs. Those were jobs that in the past allowed people with high school education to make reasonable amounts of money. And you see a lot of the unions gaining power again, like the UAW. But I don't know. I don't know if it'll be that. Obviously, not everybody can train to be a plumber or an electrician. Those are also jobs that require a certain capability, but they're not non-college jobs.
Right.
Folks, I think we really need to bring this to a close. I did promise Chris that we would end at noon. We're a bit over, but Chris, I can't tell you much. We all appreciate this, and I will get back to you. I hope we can find another date for you to come back and join us. And this has been just a wonderful presentation. So loud thanks from this.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you for the comments.